Good afternoon. My name is David Whitten. I'm here with my colleague Priya Sarin. We're here to talk about office romances and some of the challenges that arise in the workplace when they occur. I'm going to first address from an employee's perspective. First of all, when you're in a romance with a colleague, optically these can create issues, as if it's a subordinate superior relationship. There may be a perception by colleagues and other employees that there's a favoritism within the office, which obviously isn't good for morale. But perhaps more importantly, it could result in a harassment complaint if one employee feels that they were come on to, or that the advances of their colleague, romantic advances, were unwelcome, because the legal standard is you should not be making advances on somebody if you knew or ought to have known that they were unwelcome. So on a practical level, I think it's very important for employees to remember, especially if you're in a management position, that you really have to be very careful if you perceive that there is some opening for a romantic overture, and to ensure that that person isn't just trying to be a team player, or because you're their boss, that they're just trying to be friendly with you to establish a rapport, not a romantic rapport. So in that context, if you are going to go there, I suggest that you proceed very cautiously, and further, the discussion around whether the relationship should expand beyond the office in a romantic context should likely be had after hours, as opposed to in a meeting or a performance review, obviously. But Priya, why don't you tell me about some of the challenges that arise for an employer?
Yeah, I think from an employer's perspective, you also want to be really careful about whether or not you even permit office romances to be a thing in your environment, because they do have the potential to damage office morale and relationships between individuals. They can complicate subordinate relationships with their manager, and they can open an employer up to harassment complaints and harassment investigations, which can be expensive, time-consuming, and again have ripple effects when everyone hears what's going on. So there's some things that employers can do to protect themselves. One is to have a good, solid policy in place, which either prohibits office romances altogether, or if you're in a big enough environment where it's not, the potential for damage isn't so great, you might permit them, but then put restrictions on them, such as, for example, relationships being prohibited between a manager and their subordinate, and imposing a positive obligation to report if you are in a relationship with other colleagues, such that the relationships, management relationships, can be structured so that no one is ever reporting to someone they're romantically involved with.
So let's talk about terminations in the context of an office romance, because ordinarily an employer has the right to hire and fire at their discretion, as long as they don't make the decision based on a human rights code protected ground, and assuming it's a without cause termination, which is the most common, that they provide reasonable notice of termination or pay in lieu thereof. So in the office romance context, I suppose in theory they can terminate and provide a severance if they want to terminate one or both of the people, but I don't think it's quite that straightforward, is it, Priya?
No, I don't think so either. I think you still always open yourself up to the potential risk that an individual will revisit the relationship after the fact and think, was that really consensual? I was, sleeping with my boss, and I kind of got dragged into it, or I felt forced into it, and maybe you're then dealing with a sexual harassment complaint. So your negotiations wouldn't be quite so straightforward.
That's right. So additional liability may be raised, or at least asserted, in the severance negotiation, where emotions are already running high. So hopefully the message is be very cautious around romance in the workplace. To Priya's point, you should have a policy in place if you're concerned about it. That's probably the best practice to ensure that you don't incur additional liability going forward. And use common sense. Thanks for your time today, and if you need further advice, you know where to find us on the web.